again, a very good morning to you. Welcome to today's session. I should start by just making some comment on the video which you just saw from yesterday from one of the groups regarding the review of the movie The Eye in the Sky. I found that particular statement profound in many ways for the following reasons. When one of the group members was referring to a little girl who loved to play, who was helping her parents with their work, a civilian, so to say, being concerned about her day-to-day life without actually, acting contrary to the norms you should be expecting any human being surviving to do so to say. But here is that particular civilian innocent as it were, because on account of the actions of terrorists, those who were in the house preparing to attack someone. Actions which she has nothing to do whatsoever. And here is also some actions of other governments who, in them trying to counter terrorism, are planning an attack on those particular terrorists. Something again which has nothing to do with this little girl. But in the end, the little girl finds herself being affected by the actions of both the terrorists themselves and those who are involved in countering terrorism. The story of Aliyah, so to say, I would say, is the story of many civilians who today are affected by terrorism. And the issue about Aliyah, to me, brings to fore the worries, or something which worries to me every day when I wake up. Why? Because when you are talking of terrorism, so to say, doesn't care whether your country or where you are located is involved in an armed conflict. Because usually when you're talking of international humanitarian law, when you're talking of violence which have reached the extent of armed conflict, the first thing which a person thinks to say, oh, maybe I'm in South Africa, there is no armed conflict. Therefore, probably not really affected by terrorism, by armed conflict, so to say. The story is different when you're talking of terrorism, because terrorism can affect you anywhere you are located, whether or not that particular country is involved in armed conflict. What am I talking about? You might have Andrew today here sitting in this class, thinking probably he's one of the participants, when actually he's Al-Shabaab and his whole idea is to detonate a bomb. You would say Boko Haram. You never know. So with terrorism, you never know when it's going to happen to you. As Aliyah, a girl who was just selling her bread. The reason why, because sometimes when you start discussing issues of international humanitarian law, I particularly remember when I was introduced to the issue of IHL back home in Zimbabwe, the very first question which everyone, or the very first statement which everyone would say to me is, why are you interested in international humanitarian law? Because you're saying it's the law of armed conflict, and Zimbabwe is not in a war. Why are you bothered? But I suppose the story will be different when you're talking about the aspect of terrorism. As I'm saying, it can happen to anyone at any time. The reason why, for example, when I shall later be discussing the conduct of African states as far as combating terrorism is concerned, why many African countries should be actually participating rather than thinking, oh, it's a problem which is affecting Nigeria or other countries up north, therefore not our problem, because you never know when you're actually going to experience the same problem. So, I'll come to today's question, which is topic, so to say, applicability of IHL to terrorism, and I've added counter-terrorist operations. When I ask that particular question, I've written other questions on the other side, because I've been thinking, should we be talking in the first place about applicability of international humanitarian law to terrorism? What is necessitated that topic, or that question, so to say? Would it make sense to you if I were to come and ask the question, is international humanitarian law applicable to killing? If I come and ask you the question, is international humanitarian law applicable to murder? Would that question make sense? Because in the first place, I was thinking the term terrorism is just a description of some form of violence. Isn't the issue of international humanitarian law all dependent on the situation which you're talking about? Why is it scholars or individuals like you have come to an extent of then finding a description of a particular violence and then asking whether international humanitarian law is applicable? Because in general, when you're talking about the applicability of international humanitarian law, your major concern or your first port of call is simply to say, is the violence in question reached the intensity or the threshold of an armed conflict so as to talk about the applicability of IHL. So when I was saying IHL is situational dependent, I'm simply saying international humanitarian law, that body of law which is only applicable in armed conflict. So when you are saying, is IHL applicable to terrorism, are we now trying to question whether with all these regimes which we have under international law, we are failing to locate where terrorists or terror acts fit into? I'll then start with the question where many scholars actually have started to say that with the modus operandi of terrorists, it appears that they have located themselves outside international law or outside the law. You cannot be able to say with certainty which regime of law is applicable. What am I talking about here, before I even go in detail about the issue of applicability to terrorism, is to say, in general, when they are talking of forms of violence, a certain regime or a certain body of international law is applicable. For example, jus ad bellum. Jus ad bellum being the law in general which prohibits the use of force. The first or the main instrument dealing with that being the United Nations Charter, Article 2, where you're saying that generally states are prohibited from using force against each other. Of course, as I mentioned the other day, people have started to agree now that the use of force regime, that the use ad bellum regime before an armed conflict, so to say, is now also applicable to non-state actors like terrorists, which I will be also interrogating today. Then the other question also will follow. Can we also say that maybe it's not use ad bellum rules which are applicable to terrorism, probably it's law enforcement rules. By referring to law enforcement rules, you are still arguing to say that probably when you are referring to terrorists, they are just but criminals who should be dealt with law enforcement laws. Or, so to say, maybe it's not law enforcement, it's actually international humanitarian law. To say this is actually an armed conflict, or actually terrorism is a form of armed conflict, thereby the applicability of international humanitarian law. The other question, like what you noted from yesterday, what I pointed to say, it seems when states are dealing with counter-terrorist operations, for example, when they are asking, one of the questions which some of the participants noted was, the United States need to articulate which rules govern their conduct or their counter-terrorist operations. Reason why that question has been asked by organizations such as Human Rights Watch, why that question has been asked by Ben Anderson, Emerson, so to say, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on human rights standards or norms whilst countering terrorism, is to say there seem to be an obfuscation or between the rules applicable in these boards of international law when states are engaged in counter-terrorist operations. What am I talking about? You hear a state like the United States, when they are talking about their counter-terrorist operations, referring to say that we are acting in self-defense. And self-defense falls under the jus ad bellum rules. You hear in the same breath them talking about capture, them talking about necessity, them talking about trying to save other lives, some of the nuances which are found under the law enforcement rules or international human rights law to say. In the same breath again, you hear them talking about the issue of military necessity, saying that this was militarily necessary, citing rules which belong to international humanitarian law. Now, this has given rise to the question whether, when you're talking about terrorism or counter-terrorist operations, all these boards of law are applicable. The reason why people are saying that is to say, is it because terrorists have located themselves outside the body of international law to the extent that there is now a need to invoke each and every part of the rules which are found in jus ad bellum, law enforcement, and international humanitarian law itself. However, today's main focus will be actually on international humanitarian law to say, can we say international humanitarian law is applicable to terrorism? There are certain things which I need to mention, however, when we are dealing with the issue of terrorism and to say that, in addition to what I've already said, we should start about the qualification of the global war on terror itself, whether it is an armed conflict, for us to say that international humanitarian law is applicable. Because the first port of call, when you are talking about the applicability of international humanitarian law, is whether or not the violence concerned has reached that threshold to say international humanitarian law is applicable. Otherwise, it will come to the questions which I've asked to say, is IHO applicable to killing? Someone said that question is incomplete. Why? Because is that killing occurring within the context of an armed conflict? Is that murder which you're talking about occurring within the context of armed conflict? Otherwise, international humanitarian law won't be applicable. Then, in addition to that question, if you were to say that, okay, the global war on terror, or all these people who are saying that they're at war with terrorists, the question again, which you've considered before, is where that armed conflict is occurring. The reason why I'm asking that question is because terrorism falls into two categories. The first being that of national terrorism. National terrorism is the terrorism which is occurring within the borders of one state against its own nation. And you find that the definition of such kind of terrorism is found in domestic legislation. Then there's transnational terrorism, the ones which you'll be talking now of Al-Qaeda, Al-Shabaab, and other terror groups whose activities actually cross borders of nations. Now, when you're asking the question, where is that terror occurring? It's because under international humanitarian law, for example, you would find that when you're defining non-international armed conflicts, remember, I say that you would need to qualify whether a conflict or whether such terror acts are occurring within the context of armed conflict. But you don't end there. The next question is classification. What is that kind of armed conflict? Is it non-international armed conflict or is it international armed conflict? So if it's national terrorism within the borders of a country, I would suppose that would ordinarily fall under non-international armed conflict. Coming to the issue of geography, the question will be, under the Geneva Conventions, in particular, Article 3 Common, it specifically mentions that when you are defining non-international armed conflicts, is those conflicts occurring within the territory of one of the contracting parties. Now, the question now becomes, if you are having transnational terrorism, which is occurring, in various territories of many states, yet the people who are being targeted, or the conflict, so to say, is not between states and states. It's actually still non-state actors. Which, because if it's non-state actor or armed groups versus a state, ordinarily is non-international armed conflict. But now, because they are located in different locations of other states, that becomes the question of saying, how do you classify such conflict? Does it still remain as non-international armed conflict as it were? Before, however, I go to the definitions of terrorism under international humanitarian law itself, it will be important to mention that ordinarily international humanitarian law, just like human rights law, also provides certain rights and obligations to those who are participating in conflict. In other words, if we were to accept that the global war on terror is in fact an armed conflict, you come to a point where you say that it means that the terrorists themselves are combatants, not maybe let's say fighters, so to say, because we don't know if it's an international armed conflict. Say they are fighters. Question becomes, whenever you capture, for example, fighters in an armed conflict, we say in terms of Common Article 3 to the Geneva Conventions, you are supposed to treat those individuals humanely. Yet it appears that the conduct of states, especially who are involved in global war on terror, it is to treat terrorists as what others have called, or states humane generis, to say that they are enemies of humanity. Are they actually entitled to any rights or to humane treatment, as it were? Others have argued to say that what terrorists actually are doing is how can they expect humane treatment from other human beings when actually they fail to uphold humanity of other human beings? Should they be given those rights? That is the question which we consider under, for example, the detention of terror suspects at the Guantanamo Bay. Now, roadmap in general of today, we will just, under international humanitarian law now, we'll just try to look at the aspect of the definition of terrorism, then the aspect of applicability of financial to terrorism, which I've been discussing shortly, then the status of persons engaging in acts of terror, whether they are actually recognized under international humanitarian law, and then the issue of, lastly, as a way of concluding, issue of counter-terrorism, in particular aspects of armed drones, which was something which also looked at yesterday. Now, the definition of terrorism is not cast in stone. It's very difficult to define what terrorism is. That one person actually, as way back as 1986, had this to say about an attempt to define what terrorism is. To say, the search for a legal definition of terrorism in some ways resembles the quest for the Holy Grail. Periodically, eager souls set out, full of purpose, energy, and self-confidence, to succeed where so many others have tried and failed. To those who probably don't know what the Holy Grail is, that was the last, the cup which was used by Jesus in last December. So there are these, stories that Christian now is actually set out to try and find that cup. Some of them involved in wars to try and find that particular cup, but up to date it has not been found.